We start today with 1st and 2nd Samuel, which is actually a misnomer because it's really one book, just Samuel, but it has historically been split into two books. When we look at its place in the canon, 1st and 2nd Samuel, as well as 1st and 2nd Kings, are major narrative sections of the Old Testament, which scholar Robert Alter said in 2019 are together one of the most astounding pieces of narrative that have come down to us from the ancient world. And it was the 3rd century BC when it's first translated into Greek, and that's when they were split because of the room on the scrolls into 1st Samuel and 2nd Samuel. And by way of reminder, the Old Testament, when we talk about the canon or the official collection of books of the Bible, the Old Testament is split into three categories: the Torah, the Ketuvim, and the Nevi'im. In other words, the laws, the first 5 books of Moses, or the writings. And then the Nevi'im are the prophets. And 1st and 2nd Samuel, although it sounds a lot like just a writing, is actually classified with the prophets because Samuel is a prophet. And so that is how it's find its place in the canon. We will also point out that it is after the first 5 books of Moses, the Torah. Then there is Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, and then 1st and 2nd Samuel, followed by 1st and 2nd Kings. When we enter into this story, there is a history of a covenantal relationship with Yahweh, which is the Hebrew name for God, the 4 letters Yahweh. God has tried to enter into a covenantal relationship with the people of Israel. There has been some success and then some setbacks, and the people fall short over time, and things really get to a head in Judges, and there's a revelation that what we need is proper leadership, and that Israel's going to need some kind of leadership that is not a judge and is not a Levitical priest as it has been before. When we talk about the authorship and the dating of this book, we're talking about a book that was probably written as a community, as with lots of books of the Old Testament. I like to refer to them as ancient editors, not just authors. If it is a single author, then this is an author who really thinks of themselves as a historian, even though in this age and time of writing histories or narratives, facts left something to be desired. When we talk about form criticism, we're talking about looking at the Bible in terms of what kind of form is it in, or what kind of shape has it taken on. The forms can be attributed to letters J, E, P, or D. The D is the Deuteronomist, and we encountered some of the other writings, such as the priestly or the P writer, the E, the Elohist writer, the J, the Yahwist writer, in the first books of the Old Testament and the Torah too. We're going to begin with this kind of section in chapter 1 to 7, I think that's right, about the Ark narrative. That would be the Ark, like Raiders of the Lost Ark, which we've talked about before. The Ark of the Covenant, which holds the remains of the tablets of the 10 Commandments. So the Ark almost is like a character in the story too. That narrative, we think, may have predated the Davidic era. So what I'm getting into here is, you're part of this archaeology is trying to figure out when something was written. Has a lot to do with context clues within the literature itself. So there's no certainty on when it was written, but the assumption is that it was during David's reign, because it paints overall, especially in part 1, a glowing portrait of David. We'll talk about that in a second. But also doesn't hide away from some of the what do I want to say, the flaws, the fallacies of David as well. But if it is written during David's reign, that would be the first half of the 10th century BCE. So more than any book of the Old Testament we've talked about so far, this is the first one that really is catching up with modern history. Modern's not the right word, but you know what I mean. Recorded, that's the word, recorded history. David was real. There's no ways around that. David was the real deal. So you have this Davidic era. It makes sense these books were written during it, but you have this little kind of arc narrative and some other things that editors may have spliced in together from other eras of time or traditions. So it could also, some think, maybe partially composed after David, such as when his son Solomon was king. The book was probably went through a lot of major edits and changes in the 7th century BCE during King Josiah's reign, and probably even some more editing done when Israel went into exile, the Babylonian exile, which started in the 6th century BCE. And again, that would be, you know, that going in, writing a book pre-exile versus during an exile will color and change the nature of the language, the urgency, all of those things, depending on when it's written. So as we kind of encounter those as we read, we'll try to stop along the way and say, this is a good clue as to when this section of what we're reading might have been written, if that makes any sense.
Right.
Yes.
When you say editing, now I'm looking at this and this timeline, you're talking about the first editing being, 300 years later, and then another one, another 100 years later. Is this substantive changes? Is it just linguistic changes? Is it somebody looking back 300 years and saying, "Oh no, I don't think that happened. I'm going to write this instead." I mean,
Yeah,
how
a great question.
truthy was the editing?
Yeah, good question. It's really a mixture of all of those things. Some of it's a copyist making changes, right, onto from scroll to scroll. But really, what we mean here is there's some significant chunks that are kind of rearranged or brought in. So it's possible, for example, that let's say that combined chapters are 50. Let's say maybe 40 of them were kind of one group of editors, and then this other group comes in and adds the other 20% or so, some at the beginning with this arc narrative, or that maybe that came later and they were pulling that from somewhere else. It just means that somebody kind of went into the editing booth and made some significant changes, as well as little changes too, linguistic. So
Greg,
the answer is kind of yes, all of the above. Yeah, David.
I was just going to say, the way that the Old Testament was usually edited was additions, as you pointed out. It doesn't seem that they excised much of anything. They
Right.
just, if they had a different viewpoint or something, they added it, and so it's mostly a material probably that's been added. But,
That's a great point. Yeah, and I should have remembered from telling that to the Inquirers class on Sunday. But yeah, in the Bible, you don't remove anything if you want to change it. You just add it. You just retell it, or you just add on to it. And we are dealt with the ramifications. Going, how does this work? How does this saddle up with time and chronology? And that's just questions we asked that they didn't care about. Okay. In other words, a lot of mystery. Sorry for the gruesome image, but there is a very violent death in this story, and that is at Goliath. So we're in 1 Samuel, we will get the very famous, one of the Bible's top 5 greatest hits, story of David and Goliath. And it just goes to show David, casts a huge shadow over the Old Testament and the story of Israel, and to this day. And yet I think sometimes we forget that that's the same David who's the David and Goliath. He lives a full life, in addition to all his exploits with Bathsheba and all those other things, Absalom. Yeah. So I think one way to think of Samuel, or 1 and 2 Samuel, is that these, as much as they are narratives, are really character studies. And so for the first time really in scripture, if you're reading it canonically in the order it's received, you get to this book, which I guess is the 9th book in order. And now suddenly we spend a lot of time with characters and we work on character development here. And that's just, I don't know if that's just a product of the sophistication of communication styles and storytelling is getting, or if it's just a matter of how important these men were in the life of Israel. And, there's so much lore and myth and legend and history around Samuel, Saul, and David that they just tend to get more of a three-dimensional portrait from all of them. Samuel as a prophet and Saul and David as kings will be kind of overseeing, basically, this movement, which is really significant, from 12 tribes of Israel to one nation, one kingdom under Israel, or the Judaic kingdom. So what that means is that while you're kind of getting a diaspora, it's almost like the 13 colonies becoming now the United States. It's a really bad metaphor, but closest thing I can think of. The problem that comes out of that is you get also this kind of nationalistic pride, which, as we know, to this day happens in all cultures, especially once the cultures have been prospering for a couple hundred years or so. So that's going to be something else to kind of keep your antenna raised and look for. And the way they speak about David is almost like he's a deity as a result. But he is complicated. All right. And then we always talk about the structure too. I boiled it down to it's as simple as I could make it. In 1 Samuel, it's really the story of Samuel and Saul, although David does get introduced in the middle. In the first section, we have a call of Samuel to be the prophet. And then we move into the story of Saul the king and how basically everything goes to hell for Saul. Then in 2 Samuel, it's David takes the stage as the new king, and then things get a little complicated for David. And then there is a kind of conclusion of 3 chapters, which this is another example of what we mean by editing, are really kind of spliced in 4 different stories into this kind of concluding saga, which we can only assume these editors, whoever they were, thought these pieces were important and a part of the story that needed to get woven in at some point. Okay, I think that was the last slide. Nope.
I have a question.
More. Go ahead, Leslie. Yes.
Yeah, was that, you said, go back to the last slide,
Yes, I will.
please. Okay, you have 1 through 7 and 8 through 13, and then you go to 2 Samuel. Or is 2 Samuel, but you're missing some chapters.
Oh, you're right. I am. Oh, that's funny. What am I missing? Yeah, there's basically 14 to 30. So really it's I'm sorry, I keep clicking the wrong button. Whoop. Sensitive PowerPoint. Yes, thank you, Leslie. I am missing oh goodness gracious, I'm way out of whack. Yeah, sorry, there is a whole other section in there. It's basically attributed to Saul because 1 Samuel concludes with Saul's death. Thank you. Sorry. I think I was trying to put in, that's fine. I'm missing an entire, yeah. So 16 and 17 is David and Goliath's story, for example. And so from that point on, it becomes a story of Saul's jealousy of David. Yeah.
Okay.
Good catch. Thank you.
Well, it could be 30. You just could have put in the 13 to 31. So
maybe I did that. That sounds like me as well. You're very generous.
Get a benefit of the doubt there.
Yep. All right. Sorry about the pixelated image from a kid's Bible book, but there's not many great portraits of Samuel out there. He didn't really inspire Rembrandt or Caravaggio. We're going to talk, we'll start with it today, this kind of house of Eli, a priest, a Levitical priest. Up until this point, it's, basically saying, maybe not up until this point, for a long period of time in Israel's history, certainly through the first 5 books of the Old Testament, we have priests are the ones who are the intercessors, the ones who communicate with God or messengers of God. And with the exception, Moses, Aaron, is really when the Levitical priesthood launches, and so on. We get to a priest named Eli, and things are going to end with a kind of a curse on Eli's house and a movement away from the priest as the one who does the communicating between God and God's people to a prophet. And, you know, the word prophet, and we still use the word, we talk usually about preaching being prophetic, means somebody who was basically worked for God as a messenger, but interpreted or kind of spoke to those in leadership, like the king especially, and would give them God's direction, God's wishes, interpret God's, you know, where God's favor is being shown, all of those things. And you'll see that relationship really in its fullest form in how Samuel and Saul kind of interact with each other. So I think often you get this, and I'm kind of dumbing it down, but you'll have a king wanting to do one thing, and then the prophet usually comes in and says, God's not going to like you if you do that. And then the king gets all frustrated, of course, because they don't have the direction directly from God. They're going through this intermediary, and it's, you know, it's complicated. It's political in some ways, in the greatest sense of the word. Samuel is a very well-written, three-dimensional, complicated person, clearly called by God to this profession to be a prophet, but is flawed, human, complex, just like Saul, just like David. We find him to be a bit manipulative in trying to anoint Saul to be the king. And all of this sets up this kind of drama in the narrative of just, we've maybe picked the wrong person to be king. Poet Yehuda Amichai wrote this about Samuel, as being the one who kind of responsible for Saul's kingship. When Samuel was born, she said words of Torah, "For this lad I prayed. When he grew up and did the deeds of his life," she asked, "For this lad I prayed?" God. If anybody writes a poem about me when my ministry concludes, I'll be devastated. Oh, I couldn't resist a Better Call Saul joke. But yes, Saul, Saul's fate as king is very much tied to David's. And like I said, once David is introduced in the scene, Saul loses favor with God, according to Samuel. And suddenly the new golden child, quite literally, is David, and then that causes Saul to make even worse decisions. He really gives into his envy of David. And are you guys still there in person? There we go.
We're back.
All right, great. Did you miss anything? I'm sorry.
10 seconds. You're good.
You didn't miss anything. Saul makes poor choices. He succumbs to envy of David. Knowledge becomes the thing that really hinges here about what's different. Saul doesn't appear to have the knowledge that young David does. And then we get the famous line that God regrets making Saul king, one of my favorite lines in scripture, because it opens up a whole branch of theology of just what does it mean for God to feel like God made a mistake. And we'll cross that Rubicon bridge when we get to it. Knowledge, if you think about it, a lot of you know the lore, the kind of legend, which also comes from scripture, about David's son Solomon, you know, the choice that Solomon has to make, and Solomon gets attributed a lot of wisdom. So this kind of theme of whoever possesses the best knowledge, maybe not the best brawn, as in like who can fight the best battles, but who's the smartest and most clever, is kind of the one that God favors. Maybe not kinda, maybe a lot. And that leaves us with David, the great king. David turns out to be one of the most unfathomable figures in ancient literature, says Robert Alter. Everyone loves him when we meet him. He's potentially very handsome. I don't know why I wrote potentially. Ruddy. You'll hear that famous word, ruddy. Basically kind of a weird word, but it really means he's kind of auburn colored hair. So, which was being unusual then. So he stuck out. He's very calculating and smart. He evokes the tricksters that we talk about in Genesis and Exodus, which are mostly women. Reveals David's story reveals all the problems and all of the cons that come with having political power. So it's really a important narrative that kind of wrestles with these themes of how hard it is to actually be a ruler. And David is very Machiavellian. Machiavelli, the ends justifies the means. So that's really kind of a big leap for Alter called it Western literature. I guess that's right. It still feels Eastern to me, but okay. But I guess it is Western literature. I think this is the last slide. A final structure or outline for you. Here we go, Leslie. I've got the right chapter. So this is just 1 Samuel. We're going to see in chapters 1 and 3, the call of Samuel. We're going to get Hannah's song, which is really famous in chapter 2. Israel versus the Philistines. Yay, Philistines, chapters 4 to 7. And all this drama around the ark. Ark is going to turn into hot potato a little bit. And then chapter 8, Israel asks Samuel to choose a king, and the phrasing of that's very intentional. The people ask for a king, and you get the kind of idea that this isn't the most advisable way of doing things. But remember, there's a void in leadership that's been happening in the post-covenant relationship with God and God's people. Chapters 8 through 15 will be Saul's story, the rise of the monarchy, where you have a king, and then all the flaws that come with that. Then chapter 16 and 17 is David and Goliath's story and David's call. Then the majority of the rest of the book is about that tension between Saul and David. In that, we are introduced to Jonathan. We'll come back to him. Jonathan is kind of an LGBT hero in the Old Testament because it's very easy to read with a modern lens or postmodern lens and think that Jonathan and David have some kind of same-sex relationship. But we'll see if you think that's valid or not. And then chapter 25, Samuel dies, and then the book concludes, spoiler alert, with Saul dying as well. And then that leads into the start of chapter 2. So it was a good place to break them up. Chapter 2 picks up right where the story left off with David as king. Okay. I think that's everything. Yeah. I'm going to escape so I can see your faces. Hi. What questions or anything do you all have? Are you ready to read?
I know the answer to this, but it may be well, I'm going to ask it anyway. The Saul that you're talking about is not the same Saul that was knocked off and blinded, is it?
Great question. Not the same Saul. Yep. It
All
is
right.
not a coincidence. Yeah, not a coincidence that two very what do I want to say? Very scrupulous men in the Bible are both named Saul. I don't think it's a coincidence. Although it's probably a popular name back then. But yeah, the two Sauls we have are Saul in the Old Testament, which is the king, which ends not well. Again, spoiler alert. And then the other Saul is in the New Testament, and he's terrible and has to be blinded by Jesus in order to change his heart, and then renames himself Paul, or is renamed Paul. Good question, because I think you can always ask the question even if you know the answer, because other people are probably thinking the same question. Understandable. Saul. All right, let's read. Would anyone like to begin? Chapter 1, verse 1, 1 Samuel 1:1.
Oh, I'll go ahead.
All right,
Okay.
Leslie.
I'll tackle all these words.
You got. I thought you'd be able to do it. Why don't you just go ahead and do the whole first chapter then? Is that all right?
Okay, where does it go?
It is
Okay.
28 verses.
Okay, that's fine. I just was trying to see where it goes. All right. There was a certain man of Ramathaim. Can you hear me?
Yes.
There was a certain man of Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had two wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now this man used to go up year by year from his town to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions of his to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave double portion, because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. Her rival used to provoke her severely to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went on year by year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. Her husband Elkanah said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? After they had eaten and drunk at Shiloh, Hannah rose and presented herself before the Lord. Now Eli, the priest, was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She made this vow, O Lord of hosts, if only you will look on the misery of your servant and remember me, and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a male child, then I will set him before you as a Nazarite until the day of the death. He shall drink neither wine nor intoxicants, and no razor shall touch his head. As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying silently, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine. But Hannah answered, No, my lord, I am a woman deeply troubled. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation all this time. Then Eli answered, Go in peace. The God of Israel grant the petition you have made to him. And she said, Let your servant find favor in your sight. Then the woman went to her quarters, ate and drank with her husband, and her countenance was sad no longer. They rose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord. Then they went back to the house at Ramah. Elkanah knew his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. In due time, Hannah conceived and bore a son. She named him Samuel, for she said, I have asked him of the Lord. The man Elkanah and all his household went up to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and to pay his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, As soon as the child is weaned, I will bring him, that he may appear in the presence of the Lord and remain there forever. I will offer him as a Nazarite for all time. Her husband Elkanah said to her, Do what seems best to you. Wait until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord establish his word. So the woman remained and nursed her son until she weaned him. When she had weaned him, she took him up with her, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine. She brought him to the house of the Lord of Shiloh, and the child was young. Then they slaughtered the bull, and they brought the child to Eli. And she said, O my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who was standing here in your presence, praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me the petition that I made to him. Therefore, I have lent him to the Lord as long as he lives. He is given to the Lord.
Thank you, Leslie. Beautifully done.
Oh,
All right, everybody. What do you hear? What are you remembering? Thinking of? Maybe not remembering anything.
I just-
Similarities with Sarah.
Yeah. Absolutely. What were you going to say, Leslie?
I was just saying that I, after all this time and she's asked for a baby and she one, and then when he's about 3 years old, which is usually a time of weaning, I would think, I don't know if that's true, but then she gives him away.
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Fortunes change. That does sound like a long time to wean.
I know when I was when I was breastfeeding my son, there used to be this La Leche League, and you had to nurse your baby for 3 years. But according to this, I did not.
mhm.
But there were people out there that, yeah, it was 3 years. So I don't know if
Yeah.
that's what
I should
they did
quickly
here.
say I was asking the question out of curiosity, not out of judgment.
No.
Yeah, I don't really know.
There are some cultures where
Yeah.
weaning doesn't take place until 5 or 6 years
Yep.
old.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
It's not uncommon.
Well, I mean, also too, that like in that time, we didn't have baby food, you didn't have
Right.
out of season fruit and vegetables. It would have been a really important source of nutrition
Right.
during a vulnerable
Mhm.
time of life.
Right.
So
Good point. Just something to note that Hannah, prays and prays for the Lord for children, like Leslie said, and God hears her. And so that's why you're going to get to this falsely happy for us. It's like that. Why is she happy? But yeah, there's this kind of, I've given him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he's given to the Lord. She kind of turns into a setting an example of basically discipleship here and just trusting in God. But practically that's a big ask to just give your son away at 3. However, in Hannah's story, which he's about to turn into a song, she prays for God to hear her and God hears her. So what does the name Samuel mean? It comes from Shema El. El is the name for God, like Elohim is the plural form of that. So Samuel, Shema El, or Shmuel, means God has heard. So another consistent thing in the Old Testament where the names are a little bit of a wink and a nod to kind of the story as well. Think of, somebody mentioned Sarah. Sarah laughs when God says you're going to have a baby. So her first baby's name, Isaac, means laughter.
Mm.
What else?
Greg, what is the exact definition of the word Nazarite? It obviously has something to do with the temple, but
Well, that's a great question. I don't know.
it's somebody who
It's a-
was
It's a sect. It's a sect. And they didn't cut their hair. They had other distinctive traditions. But yeah, it's a sect of the Hebrew, the Jewish religion.
Any connection to the Nazarite religion? Nazarene, sorry,
No,
Nazarene.
that Nazarene Church of Nazarene refers to Jesus as a Nazarene, but the Nazarites were like Samson. They took vows like Samson did.
Mhm.
it kind of strikes me that at that time it was so important culturally for a woman to bear children, and not just children but male children, that the other wife, the second wife, her ridicule of Hannah was very much a reflection of society's condemnation or looking askance at a woman who was barren. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a really harsh word. If you think of the word barren, it conjures up, arid deserts where plants can't grow and all that kind of stuff. So, she was happy, she was thrilled that God finally granted her this male son. But then, okay, bye. It's like she was no longer being ridiculed because she had given birth to a son. I don't know, it just seems all wrapped up in what their culture and their cultural expectations were.
I think that's a really wise observation. Absolutely. And often in scripture, we're told, be careful what you wish for. We're not told that in so many words, but there you're gonna get that sensation here of just like, well, she really wanted a child, but what's gonna end up happening is she's gonna have to be parted with the child as well. But she gets the, I don't know, the love of her peers, or however you want to say it. Yeah. But you're right, that if you could not bear children, they wanted nothing to do with you. Something was wrong with you, and it's your fault, and you're marginalized. It's terrible.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I looked a little more on the Nazarite vow, and it's a vow taken by individuals who have voluntarily dedicated themselves to God. And there's certain passages that talk about what all involves. But like as Greg was saying too, about her response and the culture. I was thinking when they're reading, that it's always the woman's fault if there's not a baby coming. In this case, he did have a baby with someone else, but that was interesting. And that the fact is too that there's in the Hebrew tradition, all firstborn are supposed to be dedicated to God. So she just takes this to an extreme where she takes her maybe 4, 5, 6-year-old child and dumps him off at the temple. I'm not sure that's a common practice. I'm not sure what they would do with a a young child like that, just hand him off to the head priest. It's kind of a strange thing what she does. It's a really, really exceptional story. Yeah.
Yes, please don't leave your abandoned children at my house. I'm not gonna be able,
Greg, I know where you live.
I'm not going to be able to handle it. I promise. I can barely take care of myself.
It's okay, Greg. We won't drop them off till they're teenagers.
Okay, good. Yeah. Unless they can preach, they're no good to me. Yeah. Just kidding. This is great. And a lot of Hannah's story, not like somebody said, echoes Sarah, which is great. It also prefigures or is almost a premonition for Christians for the story of Mary in many ways. I don't think Mary wasn't begging to be pregnant by any stretch of the imagination. But when Mary does become pregnant, when she finds out her cousin Elizabeth is pregnant, what does she do? Anybody remember or say? I thought I'd quiz you. She sings. In Luke's gospel, she says, "My soul magnifies the Lord," the Magnificat. So now we get chapter 2 here. Where does that come from? There's a precedent. Hannah is going to sing a song, and this is how it goes. And I'm going to read from the translation I have by Robert Alter, which you do not have. So it'll look a little different than what you're looking at. But here's how it goes. Hannah's song. And Hannah prayed and she sang, "My heart rejoiced through the Lord. My horn is raised high through the Lord. My mouth is wide to bolt down my foes. For I was gladdened by your rescue. There is no one holy like the Lord, for there is no one beside you. There is no bastion like our God. Do not go on talking high and mighty. Arrogance slips from your mouth. For a God all-knowing is the Lord, and his is the measure of actions. The warrior's bow is shattered, and stumblers gird up strength. The sated are hired for bread, and the hungry cease evermore. The barren woman bears 7, and the many-sonned woman is bleak. The Lord deals death and grants life, brings down to Sheol and lifts up. The Lord impoverishes and bestows wealth, plunges down and also exalts. He raises the poor from the dust, from the dung heaps, the wretched he lifts, to seat among princes. A throne of honor he bequeaths them. For the Lord's are the pillars of the earth. Upon them he founded the world. The steps of his faithful he watches, and the wicked in darkness turn dumb. For not by might will a man prevail. The Lord shatters his adversaries. Against them in the heavens he thunders. The Lord judges the ends of the earth. May he grant strength to his king and raise high his anointed's horn. Kind of got a little ring to it. Set it to music. So if you go and look at we won't do it now, but if you look at Mary's Magnificat in Luke's Gospel, chapter 1, it is almost the same template here. It's a song of praise to God, and speaks of, in the same way that Hannah does, this the brunt of the story that these editors / authors are trying to get across here, which is, we're going to get hung up on things like, wait, she's giving the child away, and what they're more focused on is, wait, she was barren, like what were we just describing it? Desert, dry, arid climate. This was Death Valley, and what happened? God made something come to life in it. That's the reason they're celebrating. That's the reason she's singing. That's the reason she feels like she doesn't really even own the child. This is God's miracle working. This is consistent with the Christian God, isn't it? Of somebody making life where there was no life before. And she draws a line here in Hannah's song, that the same line that Mary draws, which means if God can change death into life, then God will change poor into wealthy. It's like a litany of things. The warrior's bow will be shattered, peace instead of war. You see how the fervor gets kind of exacerbated by, it's not just what God's doing in this child, but the child is symbolic of all the possible things God can and will do if we have faith and if we persevere. Okay, speech over. What do you all think? Anyone never not heard of this song before? Hannah's song? Maybe kind of sort of, but not in detail. Yeah. Yes. Beautiful stuff.
I asked myself the question and I answered it, but on verse 5, she's talking about she had born 7 children, but she has many children as forlorn. Anyway, so then if you go to verse 21, it expounds that she did have more children after Samuel.
Yes, yeah. If you cut to the end, and we can read that next week, but I might come back. I might come next week with oh wait, won't be here next week. Well, I'll try to find a version of Hannah's song performed. Maybe I'll send a link around. But yes, she will continue to have more children, and the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. So again, it's called Samuel, so it makes sense that we're talking about Samuel, and Samuel's got a birth narrative that's not unlike Jesus of Nazareth. It's not unlike, you name it, anybody of great importance in antiquity, Julius Caesar, they all have Moses. They all have these kind of dramatic, amazing stories involving something kind of supernatural happening. In this case, people that are not supposed to have children start having children. And it's just another thing to underscore the importance. This is going to be a big deal. This Samuel is going to be a game changer, basically. And that's what Hannah's song is kind of lifting up to. The drama, as you can kind of see in the presentation I gave earlier, is it really Samuel that Hannah's singing about? Or is it more about what God's going to do with things that are initiated by Samuel? I almost called him Salmon, which might mean I'm hungry.
Something fishy.
Salmon.
There.
First and second salmon. Any questions, anybody today? Any thoughts? Franklin, any thoughts? All right. Well, great. What a great start. I am out of town in the middle of the week next week, so I won't be here. So please enjoy and keep reading, and I will find an example of Hannah's song in the meantime. And that's my cat crying in the background. Sorry.
Okay.
All right. Have a good day.
Thank you.